September 1st, 1939. German tanks roll into Poland. Within hours, Britain and France declare war. The history books tell us this is when World War II began. The deadliest conflict in human history didn't begin with an invasion. It began 20 years earlier, in a palace outside Paris, where the victors of one war wrote the script for the next. It was financed by American banks, built by American corporations, and enabled by economic policies that the architects themselves warned would lead to catastrophe. This is the story the textbooks skim over, not because it's false, but because it's uncomfortable. Because it reveals that the road to 60 million deaths was paved not just by a dictator's ambitions, but by a financial system that made his rise not only possible, but profitable. Follow me as we uncover the economic architecture of the apocalypse, the series of decisions, investments, and catastrophic mistakes that built the Third Reich. June 1919, the Palace of Versailles. After the end of the Great War, Germany had become a struggling economy. As if the damage done to the country's economy by the war wasn't enough, the victors forced Germany to pay reparations under the Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, which was clearly revenge, cloaked in the form of a legal agreement. The major powers in Europe and the United States wanted to ensure Germany would never again be a threat to European peace. Under the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was forced to accept sole responsibility for causing the war. Article 231, the infamous War Guilt Clause. They also demanded that Germany pay for all civilian damages caused by the war. In 1921, the final bill came due. 132 billion gold marks, roughly equivalent to $33 billion at the time. That's approximately $400 billion today, adjusted for inflation. It would have been one thing if the Allies had only demanded reparations rather than going further to humiliate Germany. For context, Germany had already been stripped of 13% of its territory and 12% of its population. The land taken included 48% of Germany's iron production capacity and a significant portion of its coal resources. The German military was slashed to just 100,000 soldiers. The Navy was limited to 15,000 sailors and banned from operating submarines. It's not that the Allies didn't know they were planting seeds that might lead to a much bigger conflict. They were simply hell-bent on taking revenge and ensuring Germany would never stand up to them again. The British economist John Maynard Keynes, who had served as the principal representative of the British Treasury at the Paris Peace Conference, was so shocked by the conditions of the treaty that in his 1919 book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, he referred to it as a Carthaginian peace, a reference to Rome's destruction of Carthage. He argued that the harsh reparations and economic restrictions imposed on Germany by the victorious Allies were economically infeasible and would destabilize the entire European economy. The Allies didn't stop at the Punitive Treaty. They made sure the architecture built to enforce it created a catastrophic web of debts, loans, and dependencies that would eventually bring the German economy to a standstill. The result of the war, combined with the treaty, was absolutely devastating to the country. Hyperinflation became the norm. Unemployment ravaged the nation. The country was thrown into chaos. Unsurprisingly to any logical person, Germany was unable to pay the reparations. How do you expect a country on the verge of becoming a failed state to keep up with such an arrangement? Its economy had been brought to a standstill, its currency had been rendered useless, its production capacity had been decimated. By 1923, hyperinflation had worsened to the extent that the German mark traded at 4.2 trillion to $1. People needed loads of cash to buy a loaf of bread. When Germany defaulted on its coal and timber deliveries in 1923, French and Belgian troops occupied the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland. German workers responded with passive resistance. The government's response to this? Printing even more money, further pushing the country down a death spiral. Late 1923, New York City. The United States saw an opportunity in all of this and stepped in as the messiah of the German people in their time of need. In late 1923, with Europe on the brink of financial collapse, the Reparations Committee formed a committee of experts to find a solution. The committee was chaired by an American banker named Charles G. Dawes. They enacted the Dawes Plan, which was adopted in 1924. The plan was essentially a mortgage of the German economy to U.S. bankers. It resulted in a brief period of economic recovery in the second half of the 1920s and ended the crisis in European diplomacy that had occurred after French and Belgian troops occupied the Ruhr. But it came at the price of heavy reliance on foreign capital. But more importantly, it opened the floodgates for American capital to pour into Germany. Germany was loaned 800 million Reichsmarks to stabilize its currency and rebuild its economy. About half of this sum was raised through Wall Street bond issues. The finance house J.P. Morgan floated the loan on the American market, and it was quickly oversubscribed. By the late 20s, foreign loans worth more than 10 billion Reichsmarks had flowed into Germany. Some estimates suggest U.S. loans under the Dawes Plan and the subsequent Young Plan exceeded $3 billion. And here's the thing that most history books gloss over. This created a bizarre circular flow of money. American banks lent money to Germany. Germany used that money to pay reparations to France and Britain. France and Britain used those reparation payments to service their war debts to the United States. In effect, American capital was flowing out and then flowing right back in. Everyone seemed to win. American investors earned interest. Germany got economic recovery. France and Britain got their reparations. The Golden 20s began. German unemployment fell. Its industry started booming, and the Weimar Republic seemed to have finally stabilized. The fundamental flaw in this system is that a country cannot continue to rely on endless cycles of loans to boost its economy. It's a switch that can be turned off at any time. The moment the switch is turned off, it creates a domino effect that makes the entire system collapse like a house of cards. The switch was finally turned off on Black Thursday, October 24th, 1929. The day of the Wall Street crash. When American banks failed, they called in their foreign loans. This caused capital flight from Germany and led to a series of catastrophic events for the country. Between 1929 and 1932, German industrial production fell by roughly 40%. Unemployment increased from 1.4 million to over 6 million. At the height of the crisis, 1/3 of German workers had no job. Wages fell by 39%, banks collapsed, businesses shuttered, people starved. The Weimar government's response made things worse. Out of fear of reigniting hyperinflation, the German chancellor at the time, Heinrich Brüning, implemented austerity measures. He started cutting spending and workers' wages at precisely the moment the economy needed stimulus. It was economic malpractice on a national scale. Amid all this chaos, a man saw an opportunity. A man who would later be known throughout history as Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler, an Austrian corporal who'd fought in World War I, a failed artist who'd become a politician, a man whose entire ideology was built on two beliefs. Germany had been betrayed in 1918, stabbed in the back by Jews and communists, and Germany deserved Lebensraum, living space, in the East. Matter of fact, he belonged to a radical far-right political group called the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or NSDAP, which is popularly known as the Nazi Party.
Adolf Hitler had been a joke in German politics. In the 1928 elections, his party had won just 2.6% of the vote. They were a fringe movement, dismissed by most Germans as extremist cranks. But desperate times called for desperate measures. As unemployment ravaged the country, popular opinion swayed toward Hitler's party. In the September 1930 elections, the Nazis surged to 18.3% of the vote, becoming the second largest party in the Reichstag. By July 1932, they had captured 37%. What happened? A 2019 study by the Center for Economic Policy Research reveals something chilling. Cities more exposed to failing German banks saw dramatically higher support for the Nazi Party. When the major banks, Donau's Bank and Dresdner Bank, collapsed in 1931, triggering a full-blown financial crisis, the political landscape transformed overnight. The researchers found that economic collapse was the crucial mechanism linking the banking crisis to Nazi voting. Income declines driven by bank failures strongly increased votes for Hitler's party. The numbers are stark. A 1 standard deviation decline in income caused by bank failures was associated with a 4.3% rise in Nazi support. But it wasn't just economics. The banking crisis operated through psychological channels too. The trauma of seeing financial institutions collapse, the fear, the uncertainty, the rage. It made people susceptible to extremist messages promising order, stability, strength, and revenge. Hitler understood this perfectly and milked the opportunity. He positioned himself as the savior who would rescue Germany from the chaos created by democratic institutions that had failed. He didn't talk about monetary policy. He talked about betrayal, humiliation, the November criminals who had surrendered German honor in 1918. He blamed the Treaty of Versailles. He blamed the Jews. He blamed the communists. He blamed the bankers. He promised to tear up the despised peace treaty, restore German pride, rebuild the military, put every German back to work. People, desperate for order, gravitated to Hitler's message. And he had something else, something that would allow him to actually deliver on these promises. Money. Because while the Nazi Party drew support from mass movements of desperate, angry Germans, it also received significant funding from German industrialists. Men like Fritz Thyssen, the steel magnate. Men who saw Hitler as a bulwark against communism. Men who saw the Nazis as a route to power and profit. Money poured into the party, and Hitler used it brilliantly. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. There were a series of events that led to his appointment, but we won't dwell on those details here. After his appointment as German Chancellor, he actually kept many of his earlier promises to the masses. In his first months in office, his government introduced large public works programs, including the construction of the Autobahn, which helped reduce unemployment and restore public confidence. Germany's economy began to stabilize, and national morale improved after years of crisis. Hitler also moved to strengthen Germany's international standing, withdrawing from Treaty of Versailles restrictions, rebuilding the military, promoting national unity. To many Germans in the early 1930s, these actions appeared to mark a return to strength and order. However, these economic and political gains were quickly followed by the dismantling of democracy. After the Reichstag fire in February 1933, civil liberties were suspended. In March, the Enabling Act gave Hitler dictatorial powers. Political parties were banned, opposition was silenced, and the Nazi Party became the only legal authority. He expanded the army from 100,000 soldiers to over 500,000 within 2 years. New weapons programs were launched, including tanks, submarines, and modern artillery. In 1936, German troops marched into the Rhineland, a demilitarized zone under international law. Britain and France did not respond militarily, which convinced Hitler that the Western powers would not stop his expansion. By the late 1930s, Germany had rebuilt one of the strongest armed forces in Europe. What began as a move to restore national pride and security became the foundation for aggressive expansion and ultimately global war. So how did it work? How did bankrupt, defeated, humiliated Germany transform into a military superpower capable of conquering most of Europe in just 6 years? Part of the answer is creative financing. Part of it is American corporate assistance. But the real answer is darker, more systematic, more deliberate. When Hitler came to power in 1933, unemployment was close to 30%. The economy was in shambles. The people were desperate. The Nazi government initially continued economic policies begun under previous administrations, large public works programs funded by deficit spending. The famous Autobahn highway system was one such project.
But the real economic transformation came from rearmament. Hitler made rebuilding Germany's military his top priority, and he disguised military spending as job creation to conceal violations of the Treaty of Versailles. The key figure here was Hjalmar Schacht, whom Hitler appointed as president of the Reichsbank in 1933 and Minister of Economics in 1934. Schacht was a genius, an economic magician, and he created a scheme so clever, so deceptive, that it allowed Hitler to secretly rearm Germany right under the noses of Britain and France. He invented something called Mefo bills. These were essentially IOUs that could be used to pay for military equipment without the spending showing up in government budgets. It was off-the-books financing, shadow military spending, completely illegal under the Treaty of Versailles. But it worked. The results: German unemployment fell dramatically. By 1938, it was practically extinct. Industrial production soared. New factories opened. New weapons rolled off assembly lines. The German people who had suffered through hyperinflation, depression, and mass unemployment experienced what felt like an economic miracle. Hitler's approval ratings skyrocketed. The German people loved him. He'd kept his promises. He'd restored German pride and prosperity. But it was all built on a foundation of debt and deception. By 1938, the Mefo system was straining. A large share of the bills were coming due, and the government had to resort to increasingly dubious methods. Forcing banks to buy government bonds, seizing money from savings accounts and insurance companies. The Nazi economic model was fundamentally unsustainable without conquest. Hitler believed in war as the engine of human progress. He argued that the purpose of a country's economy should be to enable it to fight and win wars. His entire economic strategy was oriented toward preparing for military expansion. The resources Germany needed, particularly oil and iron, would have to be taken from other nations by force. The conquest of Lebensraum, living space in Eastern Europe, wasn't an ideological afterthought. It was an economic necessity, built into the very structure of the Nazi economy. Germany had to conquer or collapse. Hitler chose conquest. All this sudden growth in less than a decade from a country with a struggling economy raises many questions. How did Hitler achieve such a feat in such a short period? The answer becomes obvious. He had received funding and support from somewhere. And the reality behind this is unsettling. Within Germany, major industrial leaders backed the new regime. Companies like Krupp, IG Farben, Siemens, and Thyssen supported rearmament and large infrastructure projects, benefiting from government contracts and protection from labor unions. But he also received funding from various unlikely sources. In October 1936, the U.S. ambassador to Nazi Germany, William Dodd, wrote a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt revealing that American firms such as Ford, General Motors, IBM, and Standard Oil had investments or partnerships that contributed to Nazi Germany's industrial and technological capacity. While these relationships may have appeared to be driven by profit, there might actually have been ideological reasons behind them. Let's start with Henry Ford. One of the major investors in the economic recovery of Nazi Germany, Ford shared several ideological views with Hitler. He was a dedicated anti-Semite. In the 1920s, Ford published a series of articles in his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, later compiled as the International Jew. These writings blamed Jews for economic and social problems and were widely circulated in Germany. Adolf Hitler openly admired Ford. In his book, Mein Kampf, Hitler praised him as an example of a man who had resisted Jewish influence. In 1938, the Nazi government awarded Ford the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, the highest honor given to a foreigner, recognizing his ideological alignment and perceived sympathy toward Germany. Beyond ideology, Ford's company played a practical role in Nazi Germany. Ford Werke, the German subsidiary of Ford Motor Company, produced trucks and vehicles that were later used by the German military during World War II. Ford Werke originally produced civilian cars, such as the Ford Taunus in the 1930s. With the outbreak of war, however, passenger car production was gradually halted, and the plant shifted almost entirely to military production. By 1941, Ford's Cologne works were building military trucks and components, largely at the direction of the Nazi government. According to detailed wartime production records compiled by researchers, Ford Werke produced between 87,000 and 92,000 vehicles for the German army from 1939 through the end of the war. Most of these were military trucks, engines, parts, and half-track personnel carriers ordered by the Wehrmacht. American Army reports and historical research indicate that of the roughly 350,000 trucks used by the German Army by 1942, about one-third were Ford-built, making Ford one of the largest truck suppliers to the Wehrmacht, along with Opel, which was owned by General Motors. Ford trucks were integrated into Germany's blitzkrieg logistics and supply lines, which relied heavily on motorized transport. The even darker reality is that the role of Ford's companies went beyond production alone. Scholarly and legal investigations have documented that Ford Werke employed forced laborers, including French prisoners and other occupied territory workers, especially from 1940 onward. Former forced laborers later brought civil suits alleging unpaid wages and harsh working conditions at the Cologne plant. Ford was not the only American company that contributed to Nazi Germany's atrocities. During the 1930s and throughout World War II, Standard Oil of New Jersey maintained a close and profitable relationship with IG Farben, the giant German chemical conglomerate. According to Ambassador Dodd, Standard Oil sent $2 million to Nazi Germany in December 1933, the same year Hitler took power. The company was also making $500,000 a year helping Germany produce synthetic fuel, the essential substance needed to power tanks, planes, and submarines. IG Farben, for its part, would later produce Zyklon B, the gas used in the Holocaust death camps.
The same company also operated factories at Auschwitz using slave labor. Prisoners worked until they died. Then new prisoners were brought in to replace them. Think Ford and the other companies are bad? Wait until you hear about General Motors. GM's Opel division was the largest car maker in Germany. Together, Ford and General Motors' German affiliates controlled 70% of the German auto market at the outbreak of war in 1939. They quickly retooled to supply military trucks that the Nazis used to invade Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. The head of General Motors at the time was James Mooney. Mooney was an ardent opponent of the New Deal and an open admirer of Adolf Hitler. Like Ford, Mooney received the Grand Cross of the German Eagle from Hitler. He accepted it too. Are you starting to see a pattern? But perhaps no story is more chilling, more dystopian, more horrifying than that of IBM. IBM's German subsidiary, DAMAG, Deutsche Hollerith Maschinengesellschaft, played a significant technical role in the Nazi state's administrative system. IBM's main product at the time was Hollerith punch card technology, an early form of data processing used to sort, classify, and analyze large populations. These machines were not weapons, but they became tools of power. DAMAG supplied machines that helped the Nazi government conduct national censuses, identify people by religion, ethnicity, profession, and location, organize taxation, labor conscription, and population control, and manage railway logistics and industrial planning. The Nazi regime made extensive use of Hollerith punch card and accounting equipment manufactured by IBM's German subsidiary. This technology was critical to Nazi census operations, and those census operations had one primary purpose: to identify Jews. Edwin Black, in his extensively researched book, IBM and the Holocaust, documents how IBM's machines were used in concentration camps to track prisoners, catalog their movements, and manage the logistics of mass murder. Each concentration camp operated a Hollerith department called the Hollerith Abteilung. SS personnel were trained by IBM technicians to use the machines. The trains to Auschwitz ran on schedules managed by IBM systems. The prisoners were cataloged using IBM technology. The final solution was, in part, an IBM operation. IBM has criticized some of this research. They dispute certain claims, but they have not, cannot, deny the fundamental charges. So, what do we learn from all this? What did historians get wrong about the origins of World War II? First, they vastly underestimate the economic dimensions of the conflict. The Treaty of Versailles wasn't just a political document, it was an economic weapon that destabilized Europe for 20 decades. The financial system built to enforce it, with its circular flows of debt and capital, was inherently fragile. It wasn't designed to create peace, it was designed to extract wealth, and when it collapsed, it brought democracy down with it. Second, they portray Hitler's rise as somehow inevitable, driven by German national character or the unique appeal of Nazi ideology, but the evidence suggests something very different. Without the Great Depression, the Nazis might have remained a fringe movement of beer hall revolutionaries. Economic collapse created the conditions for extremism. Financial crisis paved Hitler's path to power. The German people didn't choose evil, they chose survival. They chose a man who promised jobs, food, and dignity after a decade of humiliation and suffering. Third, and most uncomfortably, historians often minimize the role of international capital, including American capital, in enabling Nazi Germany. The Dawes Plan and the Young Plan were celebrated at the time as diplomatic achievements. Charles Dawes won the Nobel Peace Prize. But these plans pumped billions into Germany without creating sustainable economic structures. They created a debt bubble, and when it burst, catastrophe followed. Finally, they treat American corporate involvement with Nazi Germany as a minor embarrassment, a footnote, rather than a fundamental part of the story. Ford, GM, IBM, Standard Oil, and dozens of other companies provided the Third Reich with trucks, technology, fuel, and financing. Some continued doing so even after war broke out in Europe. Their executives received Nazi medals, their factories used slave labor, their products enabled genocide. And after the war, most faced no serious consequences, no trials, no accountability. Some even received compensation for war damages. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is documented history. The records are in archives. The evidence was presented at the Nuremberg trials. Congressional investigations examined these relationships. The information is available to anyone who looks for it. But it complicates the clean narrative. It suggests that the Second World War was not simply a battle between good and evil, but also a crisis produced by systemic economic failures and enabled by profit-seeking businesses that placed their bottom lines above any consideration of morality. It suggests that some of the same corporations that claim to represent American values helped build the machinery of the Holocaust. It suggests that the financial architecture that enabled Hitler's rise was constructed in large part by the same nations that would later fight to stop him. Nearly 80 years after the end of World War II, why does any of this matter? Because the forces that produced that catastrophe haven't disappeared. Economic instability still creates opportunities for extremism. Financial crises still undermine democracies. Corporations still do business with regimes that violate human rights, and they still justify it in the language of shareholder value and fiduciary responsibility. And the connections between money and power are still obscured behind layers of complexity that most people never penetrate. The conventional story of World War II teaches us to watch out for dictators, to defend democracy, to never forget the Holocaust. These are important lessons, critical lessons, but they're incomplete. The deeper lesson,
the one that could actually help us prevent the next catastrophe, is that disasters of this magnitude don't emerge from nowhere. They're built. Over decades, over thousands of individual decisions, most of which seem rational, even beneficial, at the time. A treaty designed to ensure peace, loans intended to stabilize an economy, business relationships that create jobs and profits. Each step makes sense in isolation. Together, they create the conditions for apocalypse. John Keynes saw it coming in 1919. He wrote, "If we aim deliberately at the impoverishment of Central Europe, vengeance, I dare predict, will not limp." He was right. Vengeance came. 60 million people died, and the economic structures that made it possible were built in large part by the same nations that would later fight to stop it. That's what historians often get wrong about World War II. It wasn't just a story of armies and battles, of heroes and villains. It was a story of money, of debts that couldn't be paid, of capital that flowed where profit beckoned, of economic systems that created political monsters. Understanding this doesn't diminish the courage of those who fought against fascism. It doesn't excuse the crimes of the Nazi regime, but it does remind us that preventing the next catastrophe requires more than military strength or moral clarity. It requires understanding how economic forces shape political outcomes, how financial instability creates opportunities for extremism, how the pursuit of profit can enable the worst atrocities. That's a lesson worth remembering, because the next crisis is always closer than we think. The next demagogue is always waiting in the wings. The next financial collapse is always just one bad decision away. And the corporations profiting from injustice, they're still out there, still operating, still making the same calculations. If this exploration of hidden history resonated with you, if it made you angry, if it made you question what else you've been told, good. Consider subscribing to the channel. We're digging into the economic forces that shape our world, the power structures that operate behind the scenes, and the stories that the mainstream narratives often leave out. Hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one. Because this story, this is just the beginning.